In this session, we're going to talk about actually building the budget, putting the mechanics of the budget together, and how to do that effectively. First off, I always start with a calendar. The calendar helps you kind of organize your thinking around what are the necessary steps, in what order do they occur in, who's responsible for what, and how does that connect to the other parts of the process as well. So a budget calendar is a great place to start. It really helps you think your way through what you want to include in this particular budget process. The Municipal Research Services Center always produces a calendar every year in their annual budget suggestions handbook, and that's a great place to start from. It will tell you what the required steps are in accordance with state law, and then you can fill in your steps in your community that relate to the kinds of things you're working to accomplish in your budget process on top of what MRSC already provides. So it's a great place to start. You would also want to consider whether you add community-based steps into your calendar as well. How do you engage the community, both in terms of communicating about what you're doing, but also in getting feedback from the community and involving them in your budget process. So that's, again, something to think about as you work on your calendar. The calendar helps you think about it from a bigger picture perspective. You can easily get sort of caught up in the independent steps of putting a budget together, and the calendar kind of helps you think about it a little more generally. It will call out those deadlines in those areas of responsibility, who is responsible to do what, when, and without, again, that kind of discipline, sometimes you can find yourself scrambling, and so a budget calendar that you share across the organization so everybody understands what the expectations are and again, how they connect, who's got what responsibilities, can be a good way to avoid that. The calendar is also a great way to kind of connect all the dots so that it kind of guides the content. As one piece kind of comes together in terms of the chronology through a calendar, you can make reference to that and use it, if you will, even as kind of an index to manage your way through a process. Here's an illustration of a calendar of sorts that we use here in our experience at Redmond, and I like it because it's really pictorial. We use this as we talk about our budget process externally primarily, although I will say that we use it internally as well, and if you were to show this picture to one of the Redmond staff members, I suspect they'd recognize it pretty readily because we talk about it a lot and help our staff become as fiscally aware as we can, and this is one of the tools we use. So it just sort of walks through the steps and is a good way to communicate what those steps are and why they're there and who's involved in which part. Another important element in building a budget is to be very clear about who's supposed to be doing what. So we typically call these budget guidelines, but they're really instructions. They're really who's being expected to accomplish what work product at what time and under what parameters. These are important to help make sure that at the end of a lot of different people doing a lot of different things, that it really looks connected and is really cohesive and part of reflecting the whole organization rather than independent parts. I've seen budgets where it's clear that they were not working in a consistent approach, and you'll look at one part of the budget and it'll be kind of put together using one set of criteria, and a different part of the budget will be pretty different, and you can avoid that if you have good instructions at the beginning that kind of guide content. The instructions are where you want to talk about what the focus is for this budget. Is this a growth budget? Is this a cutback budget? Where are we emphasizing? What are some of the parameters that staff can use to think about what the cost of living adjustments maybe could occur and things of that nature. So you can provide a lot of specific guidance and details to staff as they build budgets, and they'll come across certain questions inherent in the instructions. And then once you begin to do that, the next year can kind of build on that, can fine-tune it or adjust it as necessary, but then add elements so that before you know it, you're going to have a very comprehensive set of instructions that'll provide really good guidance and help you get a great product at the end of the day. That's really an important outcome of having great instructions. Different participants in the budget process have different roles. Policymakers clearly set policy direction, but they do that, I think, just as effectively at the beginning of the budget process as they do at the end. And typically, we think of policymakers as adopting a budget, and that's true, of course. They do need to adopt the ordinance that will, in fact, make that budget official. But when they get the budget to consider and go through and make whatever changes they will so that they can adopt an ordinance and adopt the budget, hopefully they've already had their fingerprints on policy direction so that the budget is reflective of what they think as policymakers is important in the community. The chief executive officer, either the mayor or city manager in a city, is also an important participant. They propose a preliminary or recommended budget to the council by the end of October. And this budget, if they're a strong mayor, an elected, independently elected mayor, they can reflect whatever they think their priorities are in this preliminary budget. And sometimes the politics of this creates some conversation between a council who may have one view of what the priorities are and a mayor who may have a different view of the priorities, but that's the mayor's prerogative. A strong mayor or an independently elected mayor gets to propose a budget that he thinks or she thinks reflects what they see as important in the community. Whereas a city manager has the same responsibility, but is oftentimes really much more informed by the direction that they've received and that they believe the council will provide going forward on the budget. The budget that's proposed, the preliminary budget that's proposed by the CEO, also includes the revenue estimates so that the proposed expenditures and the revenues will be balanced. The preliminary budget is required to be a balanced proposal. Staff develops the budget recommendations oftentimes, and so they'll put together the thinking around the various programs and activities that make up the budget, but they'll do that consistent with the chief executive officer's proposal and consistent as a result of following those instructions and guidelines we just talked about. You'll need to make some forecasts in your budget, and you'll need to forecast revenues and some expenses, and this can be daunting. It's important to just sort of start with what you already have a pretty good handle on. Property taxes are relatively easy to forecast because they're pretty much based on increments from the past property taxes, and then you factor in either levy rates in a declining assessed value environment or maybe new construction where there has been some additions to the tax base. Salaries, again, you can forecast based on your knowledge of what you think the labor markets are going to do, your union contracts. So those kinds of things are pretty well known, and you can leverage what you know and start there. Start with the easy stuff. And then as you get into the more challenging areas, such as sales tax forecasts or utility or fuel costs going forward, you may want to consider various scenarios. If sales activity increases by X%, this will be the result. If it increases by Y%, then that will be the result. And the difference is this much money, so that's kind of the risk of the forecast. We have a potential variation of this amount, and then that'll allow the organization to decide how to deal with that risk, either to use the lower number and be conservative, or use the higher number but know that you need to watch it carefully. So oftentimes scenarios are important as you deal with the more variable kinds of costs or revenue forecasts that can occur. Transparency is very important in the budget process, and oftentimes the other participants just want to know what's going on. They want to have some insight as to what part of the activity is going on. This is where a calendar can be helpful so that policymakers, for instance, can know we're working hard on developing budget proposals and we are using the goals that you've given us to use as a focus area because here's what the instructions said. So having an ongoing dialogue can oftentimes help participants feel more comfortable that, that progress is being made and work is being done, even though it may not be involving them at this point in time. And communication of this nature doesn't just happen. It takes effort. It needs to be something you work at doing, both internally with your staff and externally with your community. So it's something to keep in mind. What is your communications plan? And again, I don't mean to suggest that it has to be a formal, onerous plan, but just how is it you're going to communicate? How is it you're going to keep the participants involved so that they understand what's happening with your budget, even though it may not be quite obvious from what they're seeing from their perspective? Another thing I would suggest is, as I've learned, that form guides content. And by this I mean, if you want certain information in your budget at the end of this process, then make sure that information is called for by the forms you ask people to complete at the front end of the process. And it can be very simple. For instance, we use the what, why, how, and for who as criteria for what we want to know about budget proposals in the city of Redmond. And so that's just an example of it's an informal sort of a loose structure, but at the end of the day, every budget proposal has those 4 elements, and the council knows they'll be able to look forward to that when they get the budget from us. So make sure you keep in mind that we're working to accomplish things in our community as a result of this budget effort. And so take that big picture view, and every now and then it's important to step back and take a look at that forest and make sure that all the trees in it really are consistent and reflective of what you intended this forest to be, the forest from the trees analogy. Oftentimes we get sort of buried in the forest and all we see is trees, and we lose that perspective. Keep that in mind. When you're making budget cuts, think about what kinds of level of service those cuts are going to have, are going to result in your community. The across-the-board cut is really not budgeting at all. And so if everything was of an equal priority, then that would work. I suspect that's not the case. So do those changes in your budget reflect what your priorities are. And take a look at certain kinds of relationships in your budget. Are wages and compensation what you think it should be? Is it growing? Is it shrinking? Are certain kinds of costs growing or shrinking? One thing we tend to hear a lot about is overtime. And so those are things you're going to want to be able to keep an eye on yourself and provide some transparency for others who have those similar concerns. Be careful about using fund balances to balance budgets or interfund borrowing. There's a red flags tip sheet available from the Association of Washington Cities that I would recommend you be familiar with. And if you see those kinds of things happening in your budgets, then you want to be sure to have that conversation. And lastly, consider leveraging the efforts of those around you. Intergovernmental agreements are a great way to provide service in your community for the kinds of things that you and your neighbors are already all doing. And so maybe that's an opportunity for you to think about as you look at providing services to the community as effectively and efficiently as you can.